Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica with Turn the Page podcast at Syosset Public Library. And our guest today is
Jennifer Armstrong.
Welcome, Jennifer. We're so happy to have you. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and about this awesome book that you just published?
Well, I write narrative nonfiction books about pop culture history, mainly television, but I've done a few other things. So just like to, keep the lanes open. And so this is my seventh book. It's called When Women Invented Television, and it is about a time between about 1948 and 1955 when television was not very profitable yet, and no one really knew what to do with it yet because it was fairly new technology. And as I often say, if you see a bunch of women doing something, it means the men have either not gotten there yet or they've already been there. In this case, they had not gotten there yet. And so women did a lot of stuff that has been sort of forgotten in the retelling of the history. And so I chose 4 women in particular who did some things in this time that were extraordinary, that, either the people themselves or the stuff they did has been a little bit forgotten. So one of them is Betty White, who has obviously not at all been forgotten, but she, I feel like we've lost, because her career has been so long, we've lost a lot of the thread on sort of the very earliest part of her career, which is the very earliest time in television. And what a boss she was at that time. The other 3 are Hazel Scott, who was a jazz musician and the first Black person to host a national variety show, national primetime variety show. So some people were doing, daytime as well, but that was her big breakthrough. Erna Phillips, who invented the soap opera for radio actually first, and specifically was asked to kind of court female audiences in radio. And she really came up with the format, a lot of the tropes we still recognize, the organ cues, the dramatic pauses, the cliffhangers, and eventually brought that format to television and had an incredible career, was in charge of many, many, many soap operas for decades after that until her death, and some of them far outlived her, like Guiding Light and As the World Turns. And the other was Gertrude Berg, who also came from radio. She was incredibly successful in radio with a family sitcom, essentially, called The Goldbergs, about a Jewish family living in a tenement in the Bronx. And she brought that show to television, and it was really TV's first family sitcom, and it was a huge success for its time. I mean, not everyone had televisions then, but for its time, it really made a huge splash. It was the first show that was so successful on TV, it went back to radio. It was revived on radio. It had a movie. She had a line of house dresses and a cookbook. Like, she was a really big deal, and has surprisingly been sort of forgotten in the wake of even bigger stars like a Lucille Ball. So that is the really broad overview of this book.
So first of all, I want to just, for people who are thinking of reading this book, which you should, one thing that, like, when I first heard you talking about Gertrude Berg and the Goldbergs, there's no relation to the modern sitcom, The Goldbergs, right?
No, I rue this coincidence just because it creates confusion. I was just posting on Instagram today about it, and I was like, oh, it's so annoying. What I do like to point out about that is just, to me, it is extraordinary because of the fact that even people who work in the business, so much have no idea that this show existed that they just like made a show that was called this. It has, you know, tangential similarities because it is a family sitcom. It's pretty traditional. And of course it's about a Jewish family, because it'd be weird if you had a, you know, family that was called the Goldbergs and weren't. So, you know, there are these superficial similarities, but it is not, to my knowledge, any kind of homage or anything else.
Yeah, that was a little strange to me. It's almost like when you hear about strange archaeological digs where like you find something modern and then like below it there's something much grander. And this isn't to knock the current show, because I know it's extremely popular and it's good in its own way, but you know, like you find when you're excavating and you find something beneath that has like a longer history and a connection that nobody realized. So that is just like, in and of itself, that's absolutely fascinating. So tell us just a little bit about, I guess, let's start with Gertrude Berg. So she was a real go-getter. I mean, so she started in radio, and I think another thing that's always very interesting to me now doing podcasting for the library is sort of going back and realizing what a big deal radio was. Everybody talks about podcasts now, and, you know, you have these podcasts like Welcome to Night Vale. You have serialized podcasts, you know, that came a while back, a few years back, and they have become, among other types of shows, really popular. And then back before television, people would gather around the radio and they would listen to serialized podcasts. So again, that's like one of those other weird things that I feel like has come full circle. But Gertrude Berg saw something in television and realized that there was a future in it, and did not want to be on the back burner once that happened. Like once TV emerged, she didn't want to be, you know, remember that radio star who listens to radio anymore. She saw an opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this woman, I think the big theme with her for me was seeing, she could always sort of sense to not only what was going to be the next thing, but also like she had a sense for her own career. And I think it was really, I mean, you didn't even have to have a sense in this case. Like it was clear on radio, she'd been on for something like 17 years. You know, I make the point in the book that you literally like, when it's a family sitcom, you can only go for so long because like the kids grow up. And then I'm not saying you could never have something where the kids grow up and move out and the parents are just there, but like it's rare, and especially in this case. So it's like she had lived a whole sitcom lifetime already on radio and saw that. She was 50 years old when she got her TV show. That did not deter her at all. And she just thought like, what am I going to do next? And she had done like a Broadway play in between that both served as like a little bit of a tryout for her for how this would work on television. You have to remember, you brought up podcasts, and it's like, that's a good way to think about it, because you have to actually remind yourself like, oh, in radio, they weren't used to being seen. So like, it's a different way of writing. It's a different way of acting. It's all this stuff is so different. And so this way it was like transitional. She could try out her character was Molly Goldberg on stage first, and then see what she could do about that in moving her scripts and her acting into television, a visual medium. And so I think she had this sense of like, how am I going to keep this thing going? I feel like people still want something from me. I feel like people are still interested in me. What can I do next? And she saw TV sort of on the horizon. And she really was not a woman who took no for an answer lightly. She eventually had to take no for an answer sometimes, as I get into in the book. But she did not go down without a fight. And so she was just determined, like, look, there's no reason why I can't be a TV star, if any. Like, I don't know what everybody else is doing, but I think I can do this. And she basically demanded a television show from CBS and its president, William Paley. And he eventually gave in and was like, all right, you know what? I don't know. Sure. Let's try it. And it really did work. at the beginning. It really worked well and people loved it.
But yeah, that's really very cool to think about in that day and time. Lucille Ball is a wonderful character. She's been written about nonstop. So
Right.
I'm assuming obviously your goal was not to sidestep her. It was to sort of go back and say that there were many other women who were really working to elevate women in television. They were powerful behind the scenes also and in front of the scenes. Erna Phillips. So she was the proprietor of the modern soap opera, you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple, like most things, there's a couple people who kind of made similar things at similar times, but she is largely recognized as among the top people who created soap operas. And the story goes that she was working in radio in Chicago, which was a huge radio hub at that time. We're talking 20s, 30s, 40s here. And her boss, she had done a couple things. She wrote some stuff, and she had like an inspirational program where she'd share like an inspirational thought and some prayers or whatever. And her boss thought, she's a woman, she does this inspirational show, she'd be good to do this thing we need, which is we want to sell ads for women, to buy detergent and things. And this is how if any women ever get, served by television, it's usually because of this, because they've always been good to consumers. And it's a very dismissive story, even than the telling of how this worked, right? It's like some guy being like, can you just like make something that women like? Thank you.
But wait a second. I just want to dial back roll back really quickly. Is it true that is why soap operas are called soap operas?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's no other good reason for it. So yeah, I mean, and it's funny because if you watch her early soap operas, the television ones too, they're literally sponsored by like Ivory Soap a lot of the time. So yeah, that was the idea. And that is not meant, we don't think of it now because it's such an old term, but it was really clear to me in my research, like soap opera is not meant to be a complimentary term. And Erna hated it. Erna did not call it that. She called them dramatic serials, like very deliberately in all of her letters, even in more casual, you know what I mean? Like I read a lot of her letters that were to her contact and her sponsor, but they were very close friends. They had been working together for years, decades really. And I believe he was the godfather to one of her children. So, they had very casual correspondence, and she would still always call them dramatic serials in that context. So that she was very deliberate about that. She didn't call them soap operas. And that's all very telling because she, was asked to do this thing, asked to make something for women, and came up with this idea of like, especially if you think of women's lives, then it makes sense. She came up with this, she also would call them sometimes domestic serials. So, it's within the domestic sphere for the most part, which I think we've still, even now to some extent, soap operas have that family element. It's everyone involved with the family, it's relationships. That's what we're really focusing on. And so her very first ones, she had all female characters and would often voice multiple characters herself and have like one other actress, and that would be it. So it was this really intense focus on women and domestic problems. And, she, throughout the rest of her career going on into television, would constantly be kind of defending this approach in terms of like men always wanted to dismiss it. They didn't understand what she was doing. They didn't think she was doing it right. But she really thought a lot about her female audience, and she respected them, and didn't think that just because someone was a housewife, that meant that she should not be entertained the way that it makes the most sense for her.
Yeah, that speaks a lot, I guess, to the enduring popularity of soap operas. I know that some of them are kind of winding down now, although I would argue that they've kind of just taken different forms.
For sure.
You can't tell me that like there's supernatural soap operas. Even when you're watching these serialized shows now that have a supernatural twinge or something, or even things like Desperate Housewives. I mean, they are, you know, they may not have, as I know you had mentioned in another interview, the organ music, you know, but they do have, like, thinking about just some that I watch, when it's about to cut to commercial and it's a dramatic moment, they have like something, like some sort of sound to kind of cue like the drama. So I mean, I really do think that what she built with that still exists, even though it might not sound the same. So we do owe a lot to that.
Absolutely. And even just if you think about, you know, the nighttime soaps and all of that, like they come directly out of that tradition. So a lot, which means that it seeps into a lot of just our dramas now, even our big prestige dramas to some extent, like the focus on relationships, the way that, like, you know, I even think of something like Grey's Anatomy. I mean, she actually did a number of hospital shows as she went on. She loved doctors as characters. And I've been watching a lot of Grey's Anatomy recently. And so it's like the way that just things just pile on top of the same. It's like, you kind of want to go like, you guys, you should move or something, because like,
all
go
the
to a different
time.
hospital. Like,
yeah.
Stop. Obviously bad things happen here, because it's like disaster after disaster happens to these people. But that's sort of that tradition too, of like bringing in the police and the hospital elements and all of those things. Those were very big for her too, is like whether it was she had a big dramatic murder trial on one of her shows. She definitely loved hospital drama and medical drama. So, you know, all of that stuff, you can really see that still in our television, even if it's not a daytime soap opera.
Very, very cool. So I want to say Betty White for last, because we all know her and she is like the internet's darling.
Absolutely.
But this is not at all to say that this next person we're going to talk about is the least, because she really was, I mean, amazing, and must have had like just a gut of steel to just go and decide, I'm just going to do what I'm going to do. But this is Hazel Scott. Let's talk about her.
Yeah, as I mentioned, she was a jazz, like she was a big deal too. She, with Gertrude Berg, like I think of them together sometimes in my head, just because they both, when I went to look back at them, it seemed like they were so unbelievably famous, and it is truly shocking that they are not still known. Like that is just crazy. Erna worked behind the scenes, so sure, okay, fine. But you know, I don't know, maybe if they were still alive, we would know a little more. I don't know, but it's shocking to me because she was, the way I describe her, as kind of like the Beyonce of her day. Stunning. The camera loved her, as they say. She was just this gorgeous Black woman who was also an incredible jazz musician. She was, you know, all the things that happen in these stories. She was deemed a prodigy when she was like 8. She was at Juilliard, you know, she studied at Juilliard when she was a kid, was taken on as a special student there. She eventually grows up and is already kind of a star in her late teens in terms of like, she was on radio a lot, and she played at Cafe Society in New York City, which was a big deal at the time. First integrated nightclub and very like a lefty kind of hangout, in addition to just being a play, you know, a really cool place where people like, you know, Billie Holiday might play or something like that. And so she was known as the darling of Cafe Society, and toured the country, made lots of money that way, and had these tricks she would do, which is why she was very popular with both Black and white audiences. She could play 2 pianos at once, which is truly mind-boggling to me. If you've ever played the piano, she would play a song and have the
I can't even play one piano.
My
parents tried. They're like, hey, lessons, and I'm like, no rhythm, can't do it. That's pretty great.
It's so crazy, and obviously that's why we love it, right?
It's real. It's amazing.
Yeah, and the other thing she did that was even bigger was she was known for swinging the classics, which might not make any sense to us now. But what if you think about it, it does. It's like, so she would play like a classical song, like she'd take like a Bach song and start off playing it exactly the way you expect. And she would, over the course of playing it, turn it into like a swing song, which would be like, I mean, that was like the cool thing then, right? So it's like if you started playing Bach and then turned it into, I don't know, like electronic dance music now or something.
So she remixed it in essence.
Exactly.
Yes.
And someone doing this in front of you who's great at, you know, playing the piano and has this incredible stage presence and is really beautiful. Like you can see how this was a great trick, right? You can see how crowds went wild. She also got married to Adam Clayton Powell Jr., a congressman, one of the first Black congressmen, and just a huge star too. Very handsome. He was a preacher, so he was a very, you know, like charismatic, very big figure in Harlem, just as she was. And they kind of united forces. And of course, they're a gorgeous couple. They're always on the cover of Ebony magazine. Like, I have this amazing piece that he wrote that I drew from a lot that he quote wrote, I don't know, that was like my life with Hazel Scott. So you can kind of like, I think of the best equivalent I can think of is like a Beyonce and Jay-Z. You know, I know Jay-Z is not currently a politician, but you can kind of see they even have that political bent too. And they would even unite and like purposely use her platform to kind of have these social actions. So like she purposely asked to play at a certain concert hall in Washington, DC that they knew wouldn't take Black performers, and they knew they'd be turned down. So, you know, the Daughters of the American Revolution, who ran this concert hall, said, no, you can't play here. And they then just did what they were planning to do, like took it to the press. He took it to the president. Like they made a big stink about it, and she did not end up playing there until years later. But, you know, they made a point. She would not play segregated venues in the South. She would walk out if she saw that it was segregated, make a big political statement, go to the press. So she was a brilliant political firebrand and performer. And she, I mean, despite all this or because of all of this, who knows, there was a network called Dumont, a fourth network at the time with ABC, CBS, and NBC, which we still know. And they, like most upstart networks, were willing to take more chances, and they offered her a gig first as a local New York show, you know, one night a week playing a New York, just in the New York market, a little variety show, which essentially in this case meant very little. It's just mainly like her playing maybe with a band, and that's it. And it was such a huge success in New York. They expanded it to multiple days a week and eventually expanded it nationally. And this was 1950, and it was actually doing incredibly well and getting great reviews and seemed like it had a lot of momentum until she was blacklisted. And that is a complicated process that takes a while to play out, but essentially she eventually loses her show, which is the first sign, you know, and then kind of is having some trouble with gigs and things like that, but also was just really put off by the whole experience, as you can imagine, and eventually moved to Paris and hung out there for quite some time. And I think that is also another reason why we maybe have forgotten about her, because she kind of dropped out of sight in the US after this huge moment that she had of both her career and politically.
I feel like an entire book probably could just be written about that and others that have kind of been sort of forgotten for that reason.
Absolutely.
So Betty White.
Mm-hmm.
I first, obviously, like many people of my age, encountered Betty White as Rose on The Golden Girls, which I had no idea what the Golden Girls was really about when I was watching it.
Same, you know.
Like no idea. It all went over my head completely.
It's crazy, right? It's so
totally
weird that we loved it anyway. We were just like, these ladies are cool. And then I've just rewatched it recently
Yes.
and was like, huh, wow, okay. Yeah, there's a lot here that I just was not paying attention to.
Not at all. And one of my friends once, when I was younger, said that she wasn't allowed to watch it because it wasn't appropriate. Her parents said it wasn't appropriate for children. And I was like, but it's about a bunch of old ladies eating cheesecake in Miami. What's wrong with that? And then, you know, as I got older, I'm like, oh, all right.
Yeah, I know. Also, just
that's what's up with that.
Side note, they're not as old as you think they are.
They're not. And it's so scary when
it is.
I think about it now. And my jaw just drops. I'm like, wait, what? They're not.
We watched the early ones and they said, I don't remember the exact stuff, but like they basically implied, like, first of all, none of them are, except Sophia, none of them are retired yet. And then, so they're all still working. And then at least one of them says something about possibly being under 60. And I was just like, okay, that's too much for me. I'm getting real close. I'm getting closer than I care to feel to Golden Girls age. But
oh, totally. It's it's just like when you start realizing that you're surpassing ages of certain characters,
yes.
or even like actors when they played younger characters. Because I was a young teen when 90210 came out, and everybody who played a teenager in 90210 was at least 20 something, I think.
Yeah.
And now I'm like, past that.
Yep.
Quite a bit. It's a little scary, so I will get you there. But Betty White is perennial and lovely, and I know everybody just wants to create a protective fence around her and make sure she lives forever.
For sure.
So she had a career that obviously preceded the Golden Girls, obviously, or maybe not so obviously, preceded the Mary Tyler Moore Show.
Yeah, that to me, because like I'm like you, so you know, I first learned of her on the Golden Girls and like kind of worked backwards. So I mean, I loved the Mary Tyler Moore Show as a kid, and I wrote a book about it.
Nick at Night was my friend.
Yeah.
So much Nick at Night. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, yeah, I was obsessed with this show in reruns and, you know, knew her from that. So then it was like that thing where you see it and you're like, oh, look, it's, you know, Betty White from Golden Girls. And when I wrote the book about the Mary Tyler Moore Show and talked to people about that character, like they said these things that were so mystifying to me, like, oh, well, you know, the idea for that character was we really wanted to do this kind of joke on a Betty White character. And I'm thinking to myself, like, a Betty White character to me is from Golden Girls, but this is before that. So like, what do you mean by that? And they said like a sickly sweet kind of like vibe. But wouldn't it be funny if she was like that on screen? But then, and she plays this character called the Happy Homemaker. And they were like, we thought it'd be funny if it's like, that's how she is on camera. And then the minute the camera goes off, like she is this terrible person. And I was like, I felt like they were just saying things where I was like, I don't know what they're trying to say to me. And so anyway, I looked it up and saw that, like, of course, she had this whole almost lifetime of a career even before that. That was a comeback for her. Before Golden Girls was a comeback. Before everything now from the 2010 on was a comeback for her. So she really, really started at the beginning of television and was there pretty early. She too kind of was in radio, but she was not famous in radio like Gertrude Berg. She had bit parts. And to me, I think what really happened with her is that when she started getting these, auditions for TV, just because this was, as I said, like no one knew what to do here. It was a lot of weird, chaotic kind of energy, and they were constantly doing crazy things that we would never see now, just trying everything out. And so she was in the world really of local LA television, which is particularly crazy at the time. And so one of my favorite things is that she was booked to be on a show called Grab Your Phone, which is where they'd ask a question. And they thought this was amazing technology, which you can imagine at the time it was. The host would ask a question and then they'd have a bunch of girls, as they called them, women, sitting there answering phones, and you could call in, it was live, you could call in and answer the question. And that was like super exciting for everybody. And so she was one of the phone answerers, and she thought, like, what if I didn't just answer the phone? Like, what if I banter with the host and sit on the end and like do a little thing? And that worked. She got a raise, she got noticed. People started hiring her for their other weird little shows in local LA television. And she eventually works her way through a couple of these where like some radio DJ decides to have, you know, a one-off variety show. They ask her to sing a song, sure, fine. And eventually gets asked to actually co-host an ongoing variety series, or really talk show, that's going to be with this DJ Al Jarvis, who was super famous from radio at the time, and was going to be every day on local Los Angeles television. And originally 5 hours a day, 5 days a week. And actually, so it was such a success that they quickly expanded it to 5.5 hours a day, 6 days a week. And this is mostly because they didn't know what to do on TV all those hours. And so they were just like, this seems fine. So Betty was basically improvising on the live, everything was live, and live on the air 5.5 hours a day, 6 days a week with this one other guy. And it really explains a lot to me about what eventually becomes Betty White, because she's still so quick on her feet. She still has such good timing. This is because that was her training. Like, I don't know how you could get more intense training than that. And so she also, as I was alluding to in the Mary Tyler Moore Show story, developed this image of this very sweet, you know, she's in her late 20s at this point. She's beautiful young girl.
Like that is like younger than me, and
very much.
And she was lovely. She was absolutely lovely.
Right. She was just the beautiful young girl, and was known over time, eventually became known for, I love this detail, her high necklines. So she wanted, you know, she would wear these kind of ruffly dresses with high necklines because she wasn't showing it all off, keeping it to herself. And this was something they would often note in stories about her at the time. And actually, like, at first, when I first read it, I was kind of even confused. And then I was like, oh, okay, yes, I see what you're saying. So, so that is where you can see sort of the line there from that to the Sue Ann Nivens character she plays on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, which is like a joke about that kind of character.
Yeah, I think that character was hilarious. It was very funny. And I mean, I'm not sure if this is true. I remember reading or hearing somewhere that they originally wanted her to play Blanche on the Golden Girls.
I think that's right. I've heard those switcheroo things. I think it might have been that both of them even were like reading for the other's role or something.
Right. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I'm going to, as soon as I sign off, I'm going to fact check that to make sure that that's true. But I do recall that, and, you know, that kind of like just being like well-worn territory for her. So she played Rose, who was lovely. I mean, this was so cool. Is there anybody you wish you could have included?
Well, all I can say is that in terms of who to include in the book, like, I actually made a big list when I was first putting this together and narrowed it down. And so there are parts of the book where I briefly talk about some other women in the business at any given part of the business or any given time. And so those are usually women that I also wanted, you know, like, that were on my original list. And for various reasons, I really wanted to narrow it down to about 4, among other things. I think we've learned from television that 4 characters is about right. See, the Golden Girls and others, you know, that's Sex and the City, all of that. There's often 4 main characters. So really wanted to focus on these 4 and like show different parts of the business as well as different life choices that they faced in terms of being a mother or not, being married or not, how they performed their femininity, how they dealt with different ages. Obviously, Hazel was Black, so she had other issues she was dealing with as well. So that was kind of like why these 4, in addition to the fact that I wanted them to have truly, you know, it's called When Women Invented Television. So I wanted them to really like have contributed something creatively, which is not to say that others didn't do great stuff, but I really wanted to focus on these women who actually like changed the form and brought something to it. But there were tons of other women, you know, there were women directing. I mean, this is always true. I don't want to make it sound like it was never true, but like you'll always find outliers. You'll always find like people doing stuff you didn't expect, but there really were several women directing. I mean, Betty hired a few of them and then swore later it wasn't because they were women, just because they were good. You know, there were women who were like in executive-ish positions. There were women who were with the Writers Guild of America negotiating contracts. Like there were women doing a lot of stuff, and that was what initially attracted me to this era, and kind of wanted to figure out like what went on before 1955 that this was happening, and what went on to sort of erase them.
Well, thank you so much. This was a great interview. It was extremely interesting.
This one was for me very much, you know, kind of a passion project in that way. And sometimes I still can't believe they let me do it and that it's real. So it's really nice.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. This was Jessica, and our guest was
Jennifer Cation Armstrong.
And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.